Back on the King of Fighters episode, I said that I didn't actually know any of the characters in the game, and was coming to it blind because I didn't have any prior experience with the franchise. After that, I decided to restructure my process on the Dreamcast files to make sure that if a game was a sequel to another game, I played that game too. I also decided to look even further ahead to make sure that if a game was based on an extra-textual property, I would familiarize myself with that as well. This is what led me to read nearly 200 chapters of the Kentaro Miura manga, Berserk. Debuting in 1989, Berserk tells the story of Guts, a medieval orphan raised by an abusive adoptive father who trained him in combat. A father he killed in self-defense as a young man. He becomes a wandering sellsword, and his reputation allows him to join a mercenary group called the Band of the Falcon, starting a passionate friendship/rivalry with their leader, Griffith, who has his own desires of glory, as well as feelings for the band's only female member, fellow commander, Casca. I had initially just planned to familiarize myself with a basic plot synopsis worth of stories, but I found the narrative so compelling that I read all the way up to where Yuke's and Eidos Interactive's cumbersomely titled SWORD of the Berserk, Guts' Rage, catches up with its characters. I was anticipating SWORD of the Berserk, which in Japan was even more lugubriously titled Berserk Millennium Falcon Arc Chapter of the Flowers of Oblivion, to be a sort of thinned-out presentation of the early chapters of the manga, similar to what a late 90s anime adaptation did. The same stories painted with a broad narrative brush. But boy, was I wrong. This game has a very specific story to tell, set in a very specific time frame, explicitly taking place between Chapter 182 and Chapter 190 of the manga, which would have been relatively recent to the game's December 1999 Japanese release date. Back on the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure episode, I discussed that game coming out into a North American cultural environment that had absolutely no idea what JoJo's Bizarre Adventure even was. Similarly, Berserk wouldn't be properly translated into English and released until 2003. And even the anime didn't get an English dub until 2002. So just like JoJo's, this game was the first commercially available Berserk property released in North America, dropping on the Dreamcast in March of 2000. Guts' Rage does a mostly good job at soft introducing these characters, as their existence stands in the 185th chapter of their saga. Guts, well, Gutsu, as they use the Japanese pronunciation of the word, as his name, even though it's an English word that's only pronounced that way if you have a Japanese accent, is traveling with Casca, who's been traumatized from a battle with a fierce warrior to a childlike state, for reasons too lengthy and sorta misogynistic to get into, as well as a tiny, floating elfin wind spirit named Puck, who accompanies him and is mostly the comic relief for the otherwise extremely bleak story. During their travels, the group save a young actor named Rita from bandits, and when they arrive in town, they discover a disease turning people into crazed monsters. And Gutsu is pulled into the local politics and machinations of town ruler Baron Balzac, who tells Guts that he has a cure for the disease that may also cure Casca, which draws Guts' interest. There are certainly things here that the game assumes you've read the manual on, like what a Behelit does or who the Skull Knight is. But this game is fundamentally a very basic hack-and-slash game, which makes sense. Berserk is, broadly, a story about a stoic man with an enormous sword that he uses to graphically murder nearly everyone he comes into contact with. So it would seem to perfectly fit in the hack-and-slash genre. The problem here is how little gameplay there truly is compared to the enormous string of long, complex, entirely unskippable cutscenes. The balance between narrative clips and action sequences is so wildly off that Guts' rage damn near qualifies as a visual novel. I checked back on my recordings, and in the first 30 minutes of playtime, I calculated less than 4 minutes of actual gameplay. I was initially understanding of this. I know a lot of RPGs have a ton of world-setting exposition to establish, so I was patient. But as the game continued, the ratio of cutscenes to action very rarely tipped much more evenly than that. 9.5 minutes in the second half hour. The third half hour got up to 13 minutes, mostly thanks to a lengthy run that I died a bunch of times during. A run that, ironically, left me wishing I had something to break it up in the middle. The fourth half hour also had 13, thanks to multiple boss battles, but even that couldn't even get it to half action. The other problem is that for the action we do get, the swordplay just isn't fun enough to justify how long the distances are between gameplay segments. The combat is alright in a brain-dead, big sword swing 'em sort of way, but it's nowhere near satisfying enough to make it worthwhile to sit through what amounts to several full episodes of an anime. It's mostly just a button masher. Occasionally you can do a cool jumping or dashing swing, but these things are inexact too. And the circumference of the sword slash is so wide and so imprecise that it's mostly just thumping the buttons and hoping for the best until another story sequence pops up. And there just isn't anything else to it. Guts as a character is compelling in a Clint Eastwood man-with-no-name sort of way, but he really only becomes more interesting on the page when you get to know about his traumatic backstory and hear his inner monologue. Here, he's just a guy with a big sword, and that's about all you really get for his interiority. Back on the Soul Reaver episode, I discussed how I struggled to take protagonist Raziel seriously because he was voiced by Michael Bell, best known as the voice of Drew Pickles. Well, I hate to break it to you, but Gutsu, a grizzled, hardened badass who is even more somber and dour than Raziel, is also voiced by Michael Bell. And it's even harder to take seriously here, because Guts is such an embodiment of gloomy melancholy. And that's the whole thing. The game is so short that there isn't a fifth half hour. It tops out at about 2.25, and about 2/3 of that is watching it play out without your involvement. It got mostly polite scores from critics who said it looked great and controlled well enough, but just had so much exposition for its action. I'd say it's a perfect rental game, but honestly, that breakdown of watching versus playing is so unbalanced that if I had rented it at the time, I think I'd feel shortchanged that I spent my whole Saturday afternoon watching it play out instead of playing. Dynamite Cop, this ain't. For me personally, it's hard to feel too raw, though, because if nothing else, it was the catalyst for me to read an absolutely enormous amount of a very compelling, dramatic, gorgeous manga. And my experiences reading Berserk will linger in my mind long, long after the extremely brief time I spent playing Sword of the Berserk, Guts' Rage fades. Next time, have you ever played a racing game before? Any racing game? Or have you ever seen a car or a road? Then sorry. Then your standards are already too high to be our target audience.